He never expected to find a barefoot little girl abandoned in a parking lot, yet that moment changed his life forever. The parking lot stretched wide under the burning afternoon sun, the heat rising in waves from the cracked asphalt, but in the middle of that endless space sat a tiny figure that didn't belong there. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, sat barefoot with her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her pink t-shirt and light rose-colored pants dusty from the ground. Her blonde hair clung to her cheeks from the heat, but her eyes, clear, blue, and far too sad for her age, were fixed on the pavement as if she were afraid to look up. She whispered the same words again and again, almost like a chant, though no one was near enough to listen. "Daddy said I'm punished, and I have to wait here." Each time she repeated the phrase, it sounded less like a reason and more like a desperate attempt to convince herself that what had happened made sense. Cars pulled in and out of the lot, doors slammed, engines roared, and yet she remained invisible to the crowd. People walked past quickly, glancing once at the small figure before turning away, each assuming someone else would deal with it, each unwilling to interrupt their errands with someone else's problem. She felt the indifference pressing down on her as much as the heat, a heavy weight that made her hug her knees tighter. She was too young to understand abandonment fully, but some instinct inside her already knew, she was not meant to wait for anyone, because no one was coming back. Time seemed to move strangely for her. Minutes stretched into hours, the sound of shopping carts rattling and the squeak of shoes on asphalt echoing like reminders of a world that didn't care. Her bare feet were scraped, and the rough ground bit into her skin, but she didn't cry. Her father had told her to be quiet, to sit still, and though the ache in her chest grew with every passing moment, she clung to obedience as if it would bring him back. She thought about her mother, about how her soft voice used to sing lullabies at night before everything changed, before sickness and silence stole her away. Now, with her mother gone and her father's harsh words still ringing in her ears, she felt like the whole world had abandoned her. It was in that stillness, as the heat shimmered and her little voice faded into silence, that the hum of an expensive engine drew near. A sleek black car pulled into the lot and rolled to a stop only a few yards away. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a light blue suit, his polished shoes clicking against the asphalt. His hair was dark, neatly styled, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the lot with the sharpness of someone used to control, someone who never missed a detail. His name was Michael Harper, a man whose fortune and reputation made him untouchable in the city, a man who had built empires and crushed rivals without hesitation. He was a figure who inspired awe and fear, and yet in that moment, all of his power meant nothing when his gaze fell on the small girl huddled on the ground. For reasons he couldn't explain, his steps slowed. He had seen many things in his life, success, betrayal, greed, but he had never seen a child left like this, barefoot and trembling in the middle of a parking lot. Something inside him, long dormant and buried under years of ambition, stirred uncomfortably. He crouched down, lowering himself so that his towering frame would not frighten her, and as he met her eyes, he felt a shock he hadn't anticipated. Her gaze wasn't blank the way neglected children sometimes were, it was full of quiet pain, of confusion, of a question she couldn't yet put into words. For a man who had always prided himself on answers, Michael Harper suddenly had none. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than a whisper, fragile and uneven, but the words pierced him as if she had shouted them. "Daddy said I'm punished, and I have to wait here." The phrase hit him with more force than any accusation or business threat he had ever faced. He realized in that moment that this little girl had been abandoned, deliberately, cruelly, and that no one else in this crowded, busy place had cared enough to stop. Something in his chest tightened, a weight that surprised him, because Michael Harper was not a man who let emotions rule him. But as he looked at the small child sitting in the dirt, barefoot and forgotten, he understood that whatever choice he made in the next few moments would stay with him forever. Michael stayed crouched for a long moment, the tailored fabric of his suit brushing against the rough asphalt, as if the simple act of lowering himself to her level placed him in a world he had never entered before. He studied the child carefully, trying to find a trace of misunderstanding, some explanation that would make her words less horrifying. But there was no misinterpretation in her trembling voice or in the way she clutched her knees, as though her small body was the only shield she had against the vastness of the world. The sight stirred something deep in him, something that made his carefully constructed defenses tremble. He was a man who spent his life calculating risks, predicting outcomes, and seizing control of situations before they spiraled. Yet this moment, with this little girl, was entirely beyond his ability to manage in the way he knew best. "Where is your father now?" he asked gently, and his own voice surprised him with how soft it sounded. He was used to commanding boardrooms, not speaking in tones meant to soothe a frightened child. She shook her head, a quick, jerky motion, and her eyes filled with fresh tears. "He left," she whispered. "He said I have to sit here because I was bad." The words fell like stones into the space between them, heavy and unrelenting. Michael felt his jaw tighten, an anger unfamiliar to him building in his chest, because the cruelty of those words belonged not in the life of a child but in the bitter calculations of selfish adults. He wanted to believe she was mistaken, that her father had simply stepped away for a moment, but the desolation in her voice made it impossible to cling to such illusions. "What about your mother?" he pressed softly, hoping for an answer that would give this child a thread of safety, someone to hold on to. But her small shoulders slumped, and with a voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear, she said, "She's gone. She died." That was when something inside Michael broke open. He felt the air leave his lungs, and for the first time in years, he had no prepared response. His wealth, his influence, his intellect, none of it could change the brutal fact that this child had been stripped of everything in a world that owed her nothing. Michael straightened slowly, his eyes scanning the parking lot where people continued to move in their own hurried worlds, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding at their feet. He had spent his life among such people, climbing higher and higher, convinced that indifference was the currency of success. But as he looked down at the girl, pale and barefoot on the burning asphalt, he realized that he couldn't walk away without becoming one of them. The thought lodged in his chest like a blade. He, Michael Harper, who prided himself on his untouchable resolve, suddenly found himself standing at the edge of a choice that would alter everything. "Come with me," he said finally, the words slipping out before he even had time to think through their implications. She looked up at him with wide eyes, uncertain, almost disbelieving, and for a moment he feared she would recoil from his presence. But then her small fingers loosened from her knees, and with a tentative motion she reached out her hand toward him. Her trust, fragile yet unshaken, hit him harder than any contract he had ever signed. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light for a child her age, and the feel of her tiny frame pressed against his chest stirred a protective instinct he had never known existed within him. As he carried her to his car, the world around them continued as if nothing had happened, doors slamming, voices calling, tires screeching on the pavement, but for Michael, everything had changed. Sliding into the back seat with the girl nestled against him, he ordered his driver to move without explaining where they were going. For once, he had no plan, no strategy. All he knew was that he could not, would not, return her to the place where she had been abandoned. As the car pulled away from the lot, he looked down at her small face, her eyes fluttering with exhaustion, and made a silent vow that shocked even him: he would not let her be discarded again. Whether he understood the weight of that promise or not, he knew it was already binding. The ride away from the parking lot unfolded in silence, but for Michael it was the kind of silence that weighed heavier than any negotiation table he had ever sat at. The little girl sat beside him in the back seat, her legs swinging slightly above the polished leather floor, her small hands gripping the edge of the seat as if she feared the world might pull her away again at any moment. Her eyes were still swollen from crying, but they watched him with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, as though she were trying to decide if he was truly real. Michael, for his part, stared at her in intervals, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. He knew nothing about children, nothing about how to comfort them, but something in him insisted that she needed more than just words. She needed to know she was safe. After several minutes he asked her name, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual authority. She hesitated before answering, almost as if saying it out loud would make her existence less fragile. "Emily," she said softly, and the sound of it carved itself into Michael's memory with a sharpness that startled him. He repeated it once under his breath, tasting the simplicity of it, and for the first time in years he realized that a name could hold more weight than any title or signature. "Emily," he said again, louder this time, as if affirming it for both of them. She nodded faintly, her blonde hair falling across her face, and whispered back, "What's yours?" It was such an ordinary question, but it pierced through the chaos of his thoughts. "Michael," he answered, and when her lips formed the syllables slowly, testing the sound, something inside him shifted. It had been a long time since anyone had said his name without attaching it to power, money, or expectation. The car continued down the wide boulevard lined with glass-fronted buildings, and Michael found himself caught between his instincts to protect her and the gnawing uncertainty of what came next. He couldn't bring her back to the parking lot, that much was clear. But what then? The logical step would have been to contact social services, to hand her over to the system that claimed to protect children. Yet even as the thought crossed his mind, he looked at Emily's small, tired face and felt a chill at the idea of her being swallowed into a world of strangers and institutions. He had spent his life building walls to protect himself, but now, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he wanted to become the wall that shielded her. She leaned against the seat, her eyelids drooping as the rhythm of the car lulled her into a kind of uneasy calm. In that half-asleep state, her guard slipped and she murmured words that twisted Michael's heart in ways he wasn't prepared for. "Daddy said I was bad. That's why he left me." The innocence with which she spoke, the unquestioning belief that she deserved such cruelty, was almost unbearable. Michael felt his chest tighten, a surge of anger rising in him, not at her, never at her, but at the man who had dared to place such a thought in the mind of a child. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe evenly, but his mind was already making silent promises. He would never let her think she was worthless again. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly puzzled by the sight of the powerful Michael Harper sitting silently beside a little girl who clutched at the seat like it was her only anchor. But Michael ignored the look. For once he didn't care how things appeared. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and gently handed it to her. She blinked up at him, surprised, before pressing it clumsily against her damp cheeks. It was such a small gesture, one he wouldn't normally think twice about, but in that moment it felt monumental. It was the first time he had ever tried to comfort someone without using money, power, or influence, only his presence. As the car rolled toward his estate, Michael's thoughts became heavier. He had never been a man to let emotion dictate his choices, but the image of Emily sitting barefoot on the hot asphalt refused to leave his mind. It was burned there, a reminder of how fragile life could be when no one cared enough to stop. He knew that if he handed her off to the authorities, that image would haunt him forever. And so, even before the car pulled into the long driveway of his home, he had made a decision that startled him with its finality. Emily would not be abandoned again, not if he had anything to say about it. He didn't yet know how to be what she needed, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not walk away. When the car stopped, Emily looked out the window at the towering house, its stone walls and tall windows gleaming in the fading light. Her mouth opened slightly in awe, but her small hand clutched tighter at the seat, as though the sheer size of the place intimidated her. Michael stepped out first, then extended his hand to her. For a moment she hesitated, her blue eyes searching his face as if to test whether he meant what he had said. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. The warmth of that fragile touch spread through him like a current, sealing the vow he had already made in silence. He was not simply taking her into his house. He was taking her into his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. The vast house loomed above them as Michael led Emily through the tall front doors, and the girl's wide eyes darted in every direction as though she had stepped into another world entirely. The marble floor gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the walls were lined with artwork worth more than anything she could imagine, but for all its beauty, the house was heavy with silence. Michael had lived in this mansion for years and never noticed how cold it truly was until he saw a child standing barefoot on its polished floors, holding herself with nervous uncertainty. She clutched the hem of her pink shirt, her small shoulders hunched, as if the grandeur around her was too much to bear. Michael gestured for a maid to bring slippers and something warm for Emily, but when the woman approached, Emily shrank back, pressing closer to him as though he were her only shield. He caught the flicker of alarm in the maid's eyes, but he shook his head subtly, sending her away. For reasons he did not fully understand, he wanted to be the one to bridge this gap, to earn Emily's trust himself. He knelt in front of her once more, just as he had in the parking lot, and in a voice far gentler than the one his employees knew, he told her she was safe here. She studied his face for a long moment, as though trying to decide if she could believe him, and then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. He guided her into the dining room where a long table stretched across the center, set with silver cutlery and crystal glasses, prepared for a meal that suddenly felt grotesquely excessive. When a servant tried to set a full plate in front of her, Emily only stared at it, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. It was far too much food for her, a child used to scraps and punishments, and Michael could see the panic rising in her eyes. He dismissed the servants again and quietly replaced the plate with a small portion of bread, some fruit, and a little soup. "This is yours," he said softly. "Eat as much or as little as you want." She hesitated, then reached out with trembling fingers, tore a piece of bread, and bit into it slowly. He watched her every motion, feeling a strange ache in his chest as he realized this simple act, being fed without fear, was something new for her. Later, he showed her to a guest room, one of many in the house, with a bed piled high with blankets and a window overlooking the sprawling garden. She stood frozen at the doorway, staring at the bed as though it were some kind of impossible luxury. "Is it really for me?" she asked finally, her voice hesitant, fragile. Michael felt the words cut deeper than he expected. He nodded firmly. "Yes. It's yours." She stepped inside cautiously, touched the blanket with her small hands, then turned back to him with an expression he could not forget. It was not joy, not yet, but disbelief, as though she couldn't quite trust the kindness being offered to her. That night, Michael sat alone in his study, the flicker of the fireplace throwing shadows across the shelves of books and neatly stacked documents. He had spent countless evenings here reviewing contracts, analyzing numbers, and planning expansions, but tonight the papers blurred before his eyes. All he could think about was the child asleep upstairs, a child who had whispered that her father left her because she was bad. He poured himself a drink but left it untouched, his thoughts circling back to her small voice and the way she had shrunk away from touch. He had spent his life believing that strength came from wealth and power, from the ability to control outcomes, but tonight he felt an entirely different kind of responsibility pressing down on him. For the first time, he wondered if he was strong enough to carry it. Before he went to bed, he found himself walking quietly down the hall toward Emily's room. He pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. She was curled on her side, the heavy blanket pulled up to her chin, one hand gripping the edge of the pillow as though afraid it might be taken from her. In the dim light, her face looked softer, younger, and more vulnerable than ever. Something stirred in him again, that same protective instinct that had driven him to lift her from the asphalt. Without stepping inside, he whispered to himself words he had never imagined saying, you're safe now. I promise." Then he closed the door silently and walked away, knowing deep inside that it was more than a promise. It was a vow, and he would not break it. Michael had always been a man defined by schedules and outcomes, his days divided into neatly measured hours filled with meetings, negotiations, and decisions worth millions. Yet after Emily came into his life, those hours shifted in ways he could never have predicted. His mornings, once beginning with the hum of emails and the rustle of newspapers, now often began with the soft sound of small footsteps in the hallway or the cautious knock on his study door. She was still shy, still hesitant, but she had begun to venture closer, her trust blooming slowly like something fragile that needed care. At breakfast she no longer stared silently at her plate, instead she looked at him carefully, waiting for some sign of reassurance that she truly belonged here. Every time their eyes met, he made sure she found that reassurance, a quiet nod or a faint smile, something to tell her that she was not about to be cast aside again. Yet outside the walls of his house, resistance to his decision began to grow. His board of directors, men and women who thrived on appearances and stability, grew restless when news reached them that Michael Harper, the notoriously private and disciplined CEO, had suddenly taken a child into his home. They called it reckless, a distraction, a weakness. During meetings, veiled comments slid across the table, questioning his judgment, hinting that personal affairs had begun to interfere with his business. Michael, who had spent years carving out his image as a man who tolerated no dissent, surprised them all by letting their criticisms hang unanswered. His silence was not weakness but defiance, and it unnerved them more than any outburst ever could. What none of them understood was that the man who once lived only for control had found something worth losing control over. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Michael returned home later than usual to find Emily waiting for him in the hallway, her small frame swallowed by one of the sweaters a maid had given her. Her eyes, usually wary, brightened slightly at the sight of him, but she didn't run forward or throw her arms around him. She simply said, "I waited because I thought maybe you wouldn't come back." The quiet honesty of those words pierced him. He crouched down to meet her gaze, realizing with a painful clarity that every absence, every delay, every unexplained moment still carried the shadow of abandonment for her. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said firmly, "I will always come back." For a long second she studied him, as if weighing the truth of his words, and then she nodded slowly, almost as though allowing herself to believe. Their fragile bond deepened in those small, ordinary moments. He read to her at night, his deep voice filling the spaces that once echoed with silence. He sat with her at the breakfast table, listening as she haltingly told him about the few memories she had of her mother, stories laced with both love and grief. Each time she shared a piece of herself, he felt the weight of her trust settling deeper onto his shoulders, a responsibility heavier than any fortune he had built. Sometimes he doubted himself, wondering if a man like him, who had spent his life commanding boardrooms but never holding a child, could ever truly give her what she needed. Yet when she slipped her small hand into his without hesitation, or when her laughter filled the halls that had long been void of warmth, he found his answer. But the outside world did not stop pressing in. Rumors began to spread, not only in his company but in society pages that thrived on speculation. A powerful man suddenly taking guardianship of a little girl who was not his kin was bound to draw scrutiny. Social services began asking questions, and though Michael had the influence to silence them, he resisted the urge to simply use his power to shut them out. He knew that Emily's security could not rest solely on his reputation. She needed something stronger, something permanent. For the first time, he began to consider the possibility of not just sheltering her temporarily but making her legally, irrevocably, his own. That thought kept him awake at night. He would sit in the study long after the fire had died, staring at the shadows on the wall, weighing the risks. Adoption was no simple process, especially for a man whose wealth invited suspicion at every turn. They would question his motives, his character, even his capacity for love. And yet, as he thought of Emily asleep upstairs, clutching the stuffed bear he had bought her on a whim, he knew that no challenge could be greater than the cost of doing nothing. For all his wealth and power, Michael Harper had never fought for anything truly personal. Now, with a small child who had once been discarded like nothing, he was ready to fight the hardest battle of his life. The following morning he made the first call to his lawyers, his voice steady but carrying a resolve they had never heard before. "I need to begin proceedings for adoption," he said, leaving no room for hesitation. The silence on the other end of the line was brief, stunned, but then the machine of legality began to turn. When he ended the call, Michael stood at the window of his office, the city sprawled out below him, and for once he felt that his empire meant nothing compared to the simple sound of a child's laughter upstairs. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, opposition, and judgment, but he no longer feared them. For the first time in his life, his power was not about himself. It was about her. The day Michael had dreaded arrived in the form of an unannounced knock on his door, not from a lawyer or a journalist but from a man whose presence filled the room with a kind of rot. Emily's biological father had returned. He was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, his manner both defensive and aggressive, as if daring anyone to question his sudden reappearance. He spoke with a smirk that did not reach his eyes, claiming he had made a mistake, that he wanted his daughter back. But beneath his thin veil of regret, Michael recognized greed. It wasn't love that had brought him here, it was the realization that Emily's new guardian was one of the wealthiest men in the city. Her father saw not a child but an opportunity, a bargaining chip that could open the door to money he had never earned. Michael listened, his expression a mask of cold control, though inside fury threatened to break through. Every word the man spoke was an insult to the fragile trust Emily had been building, a threat to the safety Michael had fought to create for her. He finally interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "You left her barefoot in a parking lot. You told her she was punished and walked away. You don't get to call yourself her father anymore." The man tried to bluster, to insist that children exaggerate, that maybe she had misunderstood, but Michael's piercing stare cut through every excuse. He knew the truth, and more importantly, Emily knew the truth. The matter could not be settled with words alone. Within days, the issue escalated to court. The hearing room was stark, its walls lined with weary faces accustomed to the tragedies of broken families. Yet when Michael entered, his presence drew every eye. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture rigid, his gaze unflinching. Emily's father sat across from him, slouched and impatient, whispering occasionally to his lawyer with a sneer. When Emily was brought in, small and trembling, her wide eyes filled with fear, Michael felt his control waver for the first time. He wanted to shield her from the harshness of the proceedings, but he knew this moment could not be avoided. The judge asked questions carefully, his tone balanced between authority and compassion. When he asked Emily where she wanted to live, the courtroom fell silent. She hesitated, her small hands twisting together, and then she looked toward Michael. In her gaze there was hesitation, fear, but also a spark of trust. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the room. "I want to stay with him." Those 6 words landed heavier than any legal argument, silencing the father's feeble protests. For the first time, Michael felt the weight of her choice, the realization that her fragile world now rested on his shoulders not by accident but by her will. The father grew more desperate, raising his voice, accusing Michael of manipulation, insisting that a rich man had no right to steal his daughter. But each accusation fell flat against the undeniable truth: he had abandoned her. Witnesses testified, store clerks who had seen the girl left alone, neighbors who recalled nights when her cries went unanswered, social workers who had documented neglect. Piece by piece, the image of a father crumbled, replaced by the stark reality of a man who had discarded his own child. Michael did not argue theatrically, he didn't need to. He spoke with controlled conviction, describing how he had found Emily, what she had whispered to him, how she had clung to him with the desperate trust of someone who had nothing else left. His words were not rehearsed, nor were they calculated to impress. They were honest, and in their honesty lay a power that wealth could never buy. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, his words seemed to echo louder than the gavel that followed. Full custody was granted to Michael Harper. The biological father's rights were terminated, his protests drowned out by the authority of the court. In that instant, Michael felt a rush of relief so sharp it nearly took his breath away. He looked at Emily, who sat small and anxious at the edge of her chair, and gave her a nod that told her without words that the fight was over. As they left the courtroom together, the air outside felt lighter, as though the city itself had shifted. Michael glanced down at Emily walking beside him, her small hand gripping his firmly, and for the first time since he had found her on the asphalt, he realized they were no longer standing on borrowed ground. Their bond was no longer fragile, no longer under threat. It was legal, binding, and unbreakable. Yet even stronger than the paper signed that day was the silent promise between them, the vow he had made from the moment he first lifted her into his arms. She would never be abandoned again. The weeks after the court ruling unfolded with a strange new rhythm, one that Michael had never known before but quickly came to cherish. For the first time in his life, his calendar was no longer ruled entirely by board meetings, deadlines, and corporate battles. Now it was shaped by the quiet rituals of family. He found himself waking earlier, not to review reports, but to hear the small sound of Emily's footsteps padding through the halls. She would come into the dining room cautiously at first, still unsure if the warmth of this new life would hold, but slowly, day by day, her hesitation softened. She began to smile more easily, to laugh without glancing around nervously as if waiting for punishment. The transformation was subtle but profound, and Michael found himself watching it like a man witnessing spring arrive after a lifetime of winter. The house itself seemed to change with her presence. For years it had been a cavernous structure filled with silence, its beauty a hollow echo of wealth with no one to share it. Now, Emily's drawings began to appear on the refrigerator, her small voice echoed through the hallways when she hummed to herself, and toys lay scattered across rooms that had once been pristinely untouched. The staff, initially cautious and unsure how to interact with her, grew attached, treating her not as a duty but as someone they wanted to protect. Even Michael, who had once demanded strict order and discipline in every corner of his life, found himself smiling when he tripped over a forgotten stuffed bear in the hallway or saw crayon marks smudged faintly on a table. These imperfections no longer irritated him. They made the house feel alive. Michael also discovered parts of himself that he had never believed existed. He learned patience in ways his business career had never demanded. When Emily struggled with nightmares, crying out in the middle of the night, he sat with her until she drifted back to sleep, his presence a steady anchor she clung to. When she asked difficult questions about her past, why her father had left her, why her mother was gone, he found words that did not disguise the truth but wrapped it in gentleness, words that reassured her that her pain was not her fault. Each time she looked at him afterward with eyes that seemed a little less burdened, he realized that healing was not about grand gestures but about consistency, about being there again and again. The outside world, of course, continued to watch. Newspapers speculated about the millionaire CEO who had suddenly become a father to a girl with no blood ties to him. Some painted him as a savior, others as a man seeking redemption, but Michael no longer cared about the noise of public opinion. He had built his life on the judgment of others, but Emily's quiet smile at the breakfast table or her small hand slipping into his when they walked together down the garden path mattered more than every headline combined. For the first time, he was living a life not measured in assets or victories but in moments, fleeting and precious. One crisp autumn afternoon, Michael stood in the garden watching Emily chase falling leaves, her blonde hair catching the sunlight as she laughed, her laughter carrying freely without fear of who might hear it. He thought back to the day he had found her, barefoot on scorching asphalt, her voice trembling with the belief that she was being punished. The contrast was almost unbearable. That broken child had become a radiant one, not because of wealth or gifts but because someone had chosen not to leave her behind. And in that realization, Michael felt a shift within himself that was deeper than any he had ever known. For years he had been defined by power and ambition, a man who believed success was the only legacy worth leaving. Now he understood that the truest legacy was love, the kind that protected, the kind that endured, the kind that gave a little girl back her childhood. As the sun dipped lower and the golden light filled the sky, Emily ran toward him, her arms open wide. He lifted her effortlessly, her laughter bubbling against his chest, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. She looked into his eyes, her blue gaze clear and certain, and said with childlike finality, "You're my daddy now." The words, so simple yet so powerful, struck him harder than any title he had ever held. He held her close, realizing that she had given him more than he had given her. She had given him purpose, redemption, and a love he had never imagined possible. That night, after tucking her into bed, Michael stood at her doorway for a long while, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. He knew challenges would come, that life would not suddenly become free of shadows, but he also knew they would face those shadows together. He had promised her safety, and now he promised her something more, a future. As he turned away, closing the door softly behind him, he felt a peace settle over him that he had never known. He was no longer just a man who had built empires. He was a father, and in that role, he had found the one victory that mattered above all others.